trauma is something that gets played out in the present. It's a historical event whose
Very
impacts get played out here.
Yeah.
Is people's responses to trauma, they're having normal reactions to an abnormal event.
Ted Witzig Jr. is with me in the studio today. Welcome, everyone, to Breaking Bread, podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. Ted, the topic today is on the topic of trauma.
Yes.
How important is this topic? How relevant?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It's an important topic because it either affects us personally or someone we know and love. There are various types of trauma and various degrees of trauma, but the question of whether somebody that you know and love has experienced trauma, that's not a question. That has occurred. The impact of trauma can show up in people's relationships and ability to trust, for example. That part of the trauma that's below the surface or in the person's past is affecting them, but you may not even realize that they've had a trauma.
Right. Okay, so let's go into that trauma. Let's kind of work out a definition for it, try to help us understand it.
Yep. By its nature, by definition, a trauma is something that when it occurs feels overwhelming, threatening, or shocking to the person. Okay? It's something that usually you would say it's something that takes somebody off guard or it overwhelms their nervous system. So it's something, it's not a natural occurrence.
So this isn't something that we experience every day.
Correct. Not unless you live in a war zone.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
You know, so some people, you think about some of the people that you hear about in the news, like refugees in Syria or
Right.
something like that. They are experiencing these kind of things on a repeated basis. But
Right.
for most of us, these are things that happen more infrequently. Oftentimes we use the word incorrectly, you know, and somebody say, oh, that was traumatic or...
Yeah. Well, so let me ask you this
Sure.
true-false question.
Sure.
Everybody has experienced trauma. True or false?
The counselor's caveat here, if you think of trauma as ranging from big T traumas, like somebody in a war zone watching a buddy get blown up in front of them, or a rape as a big T trauma, all the way down to small T traumas in which things occur which are unexpected or and painful to us, painful emotional events. You could say on that sense, everybody's experienced some degree of trauma, but not everybody goes on to have lasting effects from trauma. And I think that's probably the things that would differentiate.
Well, because as you mentioned that definition, overwhelmed, I think examples are helpful. I'd like you to perhaps give us a few more examples of traumatic experiences and place them in buckets. And let me say it this way. If every disappointing moment was trauma, then what is trauma?
Right.
Does that make sense?
That's right.
So we've reserved trauma for specific things.
Yes, because we go through, as human beings, we go through a lot of things that are emotionally painful that make us sad, you know. And so sadness, going through emotionally difficult times, they're all valid. I'm certainly not diminishing those, but they don't generally have the level of intensity or shock that go along with trauma. So some of the common buckets that we think about, so one is natural disasters. It's not a personal trauma, it's not interpersonal, but one of the things that it does is it causes people to question their safety, okay? We find a lot of safety, like in, you know, being in our house, you know?
Right.
You know, but when I have to flee my house, you know, when
It's not the safe place anymore.
When it's not the safe place, right?
Then where is a safe place?
And so natural disasters tend to kind of disorient people about where is my sense of safety and getting regrounded. And then, of course...
So will trauma always circle around those very, very core human needs? Does that make sense?
It's a great question. And I will say that safety is a very, very important aspect around trauma. Not all traumas, but most of them, one of the things you find is either it's related to physical safety or emotional safety.
Right.
Okay? The next one is accidents. They occur like a house fire, car accident, a farming accident. Those occur around things that are part of our normal life a lot of times. You know, it happened on the job site. It happened while I was heading to Walmart. It happened while we were on vacation, you know. And so the thing about that is it adds a sense of, oh no, this could happen at any time.
So I can see how trauma then places its mark on the normalcy of life, which makes life very difficult, because what are you going to do? Avoid going to the store for food, or avoid getting in the car again?
The next bucket is crime and interpersonal violence. Sometimes people are victims of a crime, but they don't know the assailant, okay? Things like a robbery, people that were at the site of a bomb site, like at 9/11, you know, they're in situations where the victim and the assailant know each other. And so the closer that the victim and the assailant are, okay, the more trust and basic trust is woven in there.
Going back to what we previously said about safety being core to our needs, right? The closer that person is and the more role they should have played in my safety,
that's
tease up trauma at another level.
That is absolutely right. That's why when there's abuse of power, when a teacher harms a student or a parent abuses a child, when there's abuse of power in that, it's abusing the trust on many levels, but one of the reasons is that person was supposed to watch out for the person's safety. Yeah. And so that's why things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, and things that happen or even neglect as somebody goes through their developmental phases is oftentimes such a long-lasting thing, is because what was getting laid down was supposed to be, I can trust this authority figure, and they have the best interest in my mind, versus I was an object for either their wrath or their pleasure.
Sure. That makes sadly makes a lot of sense.
Yes. There are other painful life experiences, and I want to mention some of these just because they happen. I wouldn't necessarily say that they're always traumatic to somebody. They're always big, but they can be traumatic to people. So like the unexpected death of a loved one, for example. If somebody dies of a massive heart attack right there and you see the ambulance come and stuff like that, that can play in. So another one is illnesses such as cancer. When an illness that you're fighting has the potential to take your life, and you can't directly fight it. And so there's kind of
There's a helpless element.
It can be the helplessness, painful medical procedures, things of that nature. The suicide of a friend or family member, that definitely had an impact in my life. And
have you found that some people have been unaware of trauma in their life that's affecting them?
Yeah. I think one of the things that happens is sometimes people have lived with a certain reality, and that's just the way life was. And because of that, they've not ever put their finger on it. And sometimes, too, people will minimize what they've been through, sometimes just because they feel so much shame, you know, and every time they think about it or talk about it, they just feel incredible shame. And so they're like, I just don't want to open that box. I mean, there's part of me that says, oh, I would love to be able to put these things in a lockbox and never affect them. The problem is the emotional energy that it takes to keep suppressing painful emotional realities that are not healed. The emotional energy there takes a toll on us. In general, what I would say is if they've put it in a box, so to speak, and that means that they've worked through it enough that it's kind of gone into part of their long-term memory and it doesn't impact their life or day-to-day functioning, great. As a psychologist, I don't have a need to dig around in people's past. So one of the things you need to think about is that this is all in the eyes of the beholder also, because two people can be at the scene of the same burglary or robbery or assault, and one can have long-lasting effects from that experience, and one may have temporarily be dealing with the shock of that event, but over a period of time, it dissipates. It dissipates.
Right. So let me provide some delineation.
Sure.
There's one thing to have a traumatic experience.
Yes.
It's another thing for that traumatic experience to continue to exist in a sense of effect.
That's exactly right. For most people, getting back to normal life, you know, those kind of things, is going to gradually return for them. The people that it affected most drastically or that were most affected or impacted or whatever, then we need to watch them closer because in some of those, their their responses are going to continue to be impacted by that over time.
Okay, so now I want to check my understanding here. It sounds to me like God has designed our bodies to react to traumatic events. Okay, you could probably measure it from heart rate to various things going on in our brains, as well as, I'm sure, on spiritual levels.
Sure.
And then do we go back to that state of rest?
That's right.
Yes or no? We should over time, and that's really what we're talking about, is when that doesn't return properly.
God built our bodies, so if you could think of 3 zones of tension or levels of preparedness or anxiety, kind of the green zone is the calm zone where we function the best, and then the yellow zone would be kind of tense, but we can still function. The red zone is more of an alarm state, and our bodies are designed to go into that alarm state to respond to things. So, for example, if I see somebody who looks like they're going to fall down the steps, I'm going to go into action and very rapidly
get into a red state.
I'm going to get into a red state to very rapidly go and try to help that person not fall. Okay? Not even with thinking about it. You just kind of do it. But then, with that, our bodies are designed to go back down to green. The problem that occurs with trauma is that the body goes from that green zone or whatever the natural state is up to red, and it kind of pegs the meter at the top. And then instead of the body and mind kind of coming back down to green, the body starts to treat the rest state as I need to stay in a place where I'm alert for this to happen again. And so it might come down, but it comes down more to a yellow, you might say. And the body and the mind stay on guard, like, I don't want to be surprised again. I don't want to be caught off guard again.
Are the effects of this not only relational? So what I mean by that is I can see from the examples that you previously mentioned about trust and that type of thing that there would be a relational residue, for example, carried over by trauma. But is there even a physical one?
Yes. So if you think about it, there is no question physiologically in the brain and body, there's residue emotionally, relationally, and spiritually. All of those in the physiological domain. The brain stays on kind of alert mode, just like our fire alarms are set to go off too early as opposed to going off too late. The amygdala in the brain is like your fire alarm. And so, for example, if somebody grew up and experienced physical abuse from a father, let's say, but then later on in their life, they are in a work relationship where they were in a relationship with an authority figure, a male authority figure that had some of those characteristics. That relationship, even though that man may not be abusive and, in the present day, the fact that that's an authority figure, that maybe they're in a certain kind of setting, it may trigger off that sense of, oh no, I'm under threat or I could potentially be in danger. So physiologically also, your body, when it's in that alert state, it's shooting adrenaline and cortisol into your bloodstream to keep you on alert. In the short term, that's by God's design. It's there to help us in those moments when we need it. Over the long term, that leads to depletion in our bodies. And studies show over the long term, chronic trauma states lead to lowered immune responses and kind of burnout hormonal functioning in people. For some individuals, trauma is woven into the fabric of their relationships and their self-worth and how they see the world, even how they see that God sees them, things of that nature.
I sense it's a real hook.
Oh, yes.
In the sense of having a kind of a barb or something that can really kind of yank you around. And maybe for a time you kind of forget the hook is there, but then something happens and then you know very well that you're still on the line, so to speak.
It sure can. And in fact, one of the things that's quite frustrating for people is that when they're not in a situation where their trauma has been triggered, and they're kind of living life, and then all of a sudden something happens, and then bang, their nervous system is on high alert.
And they're back to square one, which has got to be discouraging.
It feels
like it.
Yes, and I would say that that's exactly right. It absolutely feels like square one because our body's alarm system responds in the present, okay? So when your body goes into its fight and flight response, it's doing that right now. It doesn't matter to your body, it's not trying to say, oh, and by the way, I'm giving you a trigger for something that happened 20 years ago or 6 months ago. It's going, right now, you are in fight and flight.
So, Ted, what you're saying then is that trauma is made very present then.
Yes.
Right? So I think that's an important concept then, that though trauma might happen decades ago, it's very much alive today.
So if you think about it this way, Matt, is in terms of how your brain processes trauma, your right hemisphere of your brain sees things in terms of pictures and experiences. It would replay the whole experience of something. It's more creative in that sense, while your left hemisphere is more about language and logic and math and those kind of things. So if you think about it this way, if I said to you, remember one of your favorite birthday parties, okay, just remember it, your right hemisphere is going to remember the experience. You're going to remember, oh, it was at this place, and we had this cake, and then we did this, and I remember. And so you're going to be thinking about this experience, and it'll bring a smile to your face, and you remember that. Your left hemisphere is going that was at the roller rink. It was about 19 fill in the blank, 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 and blank were there. And so the left hemisphere just remembers the facts of it, while the right hemisphere is remembering the experience of it.
And the feelings.
And the brain research on this is really fascinating, because what it has shown is when people are re-experiencing a trauma, their right hemisphere is lighting up. It is not only lighting up, it is flashbulbs going over there. At the same time, their left hemisphere of their brain is suppressed. The part that says, that was then, this is now. I'm safe now. That's no longer happening. And so what ends up happening is kind of the double whammy of an accelerated re-experiencing with a suppressed ability to be able to put the words to it and be able to say that was then and this is now.
Interesting. You're almost rewiring reflex, which is, again, our protection mechanism, right?
Yes.
And to unwire that reflex, it would take some doing, I would guess.
That's correct. A lot of people have lived with their traumas long enough, and they've tried to get rid of them, and they try to avoid the triggers and those kind of things. And when they can't, they just assume that this is the way that life has to be. And I don't promise any of my clients, and here at ACFS, don't promise anybody a situation where like, oh, well, we'll just take care of that and it'll never bother you again. But what we can do is we can get it to a place where it's in its right history in your life. It's part of life, but it doesn't have to run your life. It doesn't have to define your life.
Yeah, kind of a metaphor that I've really like. And it's this concept of orbits. The planets orbit the sun, right? And the sun kind of keeps them all in orbit. And some orbit closely, and some orbit at a great distance. And everything in our life falls into orbit, in a sense. Yeah. And really, in placing that in its proper orbit allows us to relate to it appropriately.
That's correct. Oftentimes, because there's been some kind of damage that is long-term. Like if somebody was at the scene of an accident where someone was killed, life is different after that. And oftentimes people will segment their lives pre and post their trauma. The thing about it is, right after a trauma, the orbit of that trauma, it is central to like dealing with the aftermath.
In fact, we might be orbiting it.
Yes, correct. And so I like to think about it in some phases. I didn't come up with these phases, but we use them a lot with people. And we say that the first phase after somebody's experienced a trauma is the victim phase. And the victim phase is they've experienced that, and they're just trying to deal with the aftermath of it. And in essence, they're wishing they weren't in the orbit of that thing. They wish that it wouldn't be defining them or wouldn't be coming into their thoughts or coming into their dreams or interfering, but it is. So that's the victim phase. The next phase is called the survivor phase, and that's where somebody is finding out how to live and to move forward where the trauma isn't defining them as much, and they're moving forward, they're getting on with their life, they're trying to be able to see that as something that happened, it was impactful, but also that it's not in the forefront of their mind. It's starting to be able to see it in the rearview mirror and coming to terms with it. Because some things will have to be grieved, some things will have to be overcome.
But it still is very much part of the fabric.
It is.
There's no escaping that event. I am a survivor of X, Y, or Z. I went through, this is part of my experience.
Exactly.
And that becomes very much a part of our story.
Exactly. And there's a phase beyond that, and we call it the thriver or the overcomer. So it's victim, survivor, thriver. And that's where the person gets to a place where the traumas have been integrated enough and become part of the overall narrative of their life so that they can actually, not that the thing was good in and of itself, because I'm not going to tell you that those experiences in and of themselves were good, but they can also get to a place where they can see those as they are not defined by that. They're defined by their relationship with Christ, their ability to go forward and even be able to see their pain that they've been through as a platform to be able to minister to other people. That's not an easy place to get to, and I certainly don't put it on my clients as like, okay, to get through this, you have to go out and be very public about some people are going to be very private with those things, but
it very much speaks to the beauty from ashes concept that Isaiah speaks of.
Absolutely.
Which is very central to the gospel and to what Christ continually and routinely did in lives, would seemingly take trauma, would take brokenness, and redeem it for some good.
Yes, and I believe really strongly on that end that God's grace in this is to bring people to those places where that they know that they are loved, that they can walk through this in a place of healing.
So Ted, have you seen that? Have you seen a person go from victim to overcoming?
Yes.
Is that the term you used, overcoming?
Yes, I have. It is hard work, and I don't want to minimize the hard work. I also believe that it is possible. I believe that it is best possible when it's done in the context of people being able to have kind of these layers of support around them as well, so they're getting good trauma treatment, but also that they have people in their lives who are there to support them in that, to have someone who just, I believe you. I want to see you healed. I want to walk with you through this. And I'm not going to reject you, and I'm not going to pretend that it's not hard or even that I've been through something similar. But just to know that they're loved and accepted for where they're at, it's a very powerful thing.
So then what you've just communicated then is the power and importance for community.
Absolutely.
In this healing process, as you've described it. And I would have to think then that the church finds a very unique and important place then in caring for individuals like this.
Yep. And again, certain traumas are more easily public than others, but even when people have gone through a lot of private things or things in their history that they choose not to share with many, to have that small core group of a mentor, one of the ministers, and it's going to vary by the person or the situation. But to have that community of people walking with somebody is it's a beautiful sight, because none of us as counselors believe that we are the beginning and the ending of God's design for care or treatment of the person. It is we're one part of the body working together. I work with people an hour, a week, or maybe two sometimes when things are really intense. That means there's a lot of time that I need people outside of the counseling office being the hands and feet of Jesus to other people.
And that is exactly why we like to air this type of content, to bring awareness to the reality that many experience. Thanks. We're going to cut in on the conversation, and we're going to stop today's episode. We look forward to picking up next time with more on trauma. Thanks, everyone, for being with us.